Okay, this is a brief overview of the second midterm. So we'll start with question 1, which is based on chapter 7. Discuss in detail the role of unions and working class workers in the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, so remember, you're going to go into detail here, right? You're not going to just say, well, unions were important for working class people working in factories in the early 19th and into the 20th century. That's true, but it's not the whole story. So make sure you're giving the detail. And of course, I've given you some pages to review so you can make sure you're looking in the right area. How did labor unions rise and fall during the 20th century? How has unionization in the US differed from that in many European countries? There is, of course, information in the textbook about how labor unions began to take off. That is, the membership began to rise. But then, of course, by the latter part of the 20th century, there were some things that occurred, and in particular, in the early 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, that changed the way that unions were treated, not only by employers, but also in terms of how the labor laws were interpreted by the National Labor Relations Board. And so focus on that part of the story there. The unionization in Europe versus the United States, there's information in the text about that. You want to make sure that you're discussing how the view of unions differs and possibly why that is. Finally, discuss the challenges for working class women regarding finding childcare so they can work. Okay, so again, I pointed you to the pages there. Explain the development of welfare programs in the 20th century and describe who the beneficiaries were and how the perception of the beneficiaries impacted public and government support for these programs. Okay, again, welfare programs are not new. They've been around for a very long time, particularly during the Great Depression. Quite a few of them were created by then President Roosevelt. And the perception of welfare programs has changed over time, and that may have to do with who are getting the benefits, what group of people are most likely to be getting the benefits, and how the perception of those people has changed the way that Americans feel about these programs and whether they continue to support them. Discuss how the U.S. measures poverty and explain the criticisms of the method. Okay, absolute discussion in the textbook about absolute versus relative poverty and the fact that the U.S. uses absolute poverty. And there are criticisms of using that measurement of poverty. So make sure you review that. Finally, do you support a higher minimum wage than the current federal standard? Okay, current federal standard is $7.25 an hour. Of course, states are free to have higher minimum wages, and many of them do, including California. But there are some people who argue that the federal minimum wage should be higher, that it shouldn't be up to states to provide a higher minimum wage, that is something the federal government should be in charge of, and they should do it more frequently. I gave you a link there. You can check out the information on the U.S. Labor Department's website and also see a history of the federal minimum wage. And then give me your feeling about whether or not it should be raised, with at least 2 reasons to support it. Question number 3 comes from chapter 5. Analyze how education for the upper class affects a person's life. Then compare your educational experience, and here focusing on K through 12, with the upper class and explain the similarities and differences. All right, so first, there's great discussion in the text about education for the upper class, the kinds of education that they get, the opportunities that the education affords them. And then think about your own K through 12 experience, compare it with that of upper class people, and find the similarities that you can and tell me what those are. Find the differences that you can and tell me what those are. Analyze corporate leadership in the US and explain how corporate leaders maintain corporate hierarchies. Okay, again, lots of good information there on those pages. Do you think students graduating from universities such as the University of Laverne have just as good an opportunity of making it to the top of corporate America as students graduating from Ivy League universities? Okay, that's just your opinion. Please, of course, support your opinion. Tell me why you believe what you believe. Finally, chapter 6 is the question. Chapter 6 is the question that I'm having difficulty here. Question number 4 is based on chapter 6. There. Explain how the, quote, ecology of class, unquote, affects a person's life quality. Explain how the middle class uses networking and discuss how social media has recently played a role. Okay, I've given you some pages to review there. Make sure you do that. Describe how downsizing, outsourcing, and temp work affect middle class workers. So remember, you've got to make sure to talk about all three. Downsizing separately, outsourcing separately, and temp work. These are 3 different things, so you've got to talk about each one of them separately. Don't just make one statement and lump them all 3 together. In your opinion, is social mobility a realistic goal for most people in the U.S.? Why or why not? Okay, again, that part is just your opinion. Please provide some examples or details for why you have reached the conclusion that you did. That's it. Again, I won't need to wish any of you good luck because I know that you're going to study.